And Mike, talk to us about moral injury, the part that isn't being met.
As we sit in the middle of 2016, we've just had the Chilcot report produced, which is fundamentally what everybody's understood to be the case with Iraq in particular, was that this war was initiated on false grounds. Just like the Vietnam War was initiated by exaggerating a conflict with the USS Maddox, and that was an excuse to pass a law which allowed US servicemen to enter Vietnam. It was a false premise. You didn't have the history, for instance, of Northern Ireland going back centuries, where you actually understood at some level the complexity of conflict and the injustices that had taken place over centuries. This is different. This is a manufactured reason. So therefore, with moral injury, you have the challenge to your own system on a number of levels. Firstly, it's a shock. War is a shock to the system. It isn't quite what you believe. You don't quite expect that you're the person to shit yourself when the first rounds hit. This is normal. People freeze. People act out of character. This is how it is. There's a whole process of having to train the individual to dehumanize them to a certain degree, to actually act on behalf of another system, an establishment which will ask them to do stuff. So then you've got the physical activity, what's going on, and witnessing what happens around you. And then underneath that is actually, but I don't believe this, I don't agree with this, this isn't right. And once you go in there with honest intention and sense of duty, I mean, no one who's going to Iraq knew it was all about oil, but there's a sense of duty of serving the establishment and the team. Push comes to it, it's actually the team and the tribe that you're going there, because it goes back to, why did you join the army in the first place? So you start hitting some moral challenges. So what's the legitimacy of this war? Why am I doing this? Why haven't I got the right kind of kit? I don't feel right witnessing what happened to those children. I don't feel right witnessing what happened to those women. It doesn't feel right what I'm witnessing here. There is something wrong here. And that can turn up as guilt or whatever it might be. It can turn up as flashbacks of images, but there's an underlying sense of, I am broken. There is something wrong. And that's moral injury. That whole area is moral injury. That isn't about a specific post-traumatic stress disorder which relates to an incident, and war is cumulative, so you can never trace it back to an incident. It will always be cumulative. So there's a complexity to trauma, which is why in Unload we talk about trauma. Recognising terms such as moral injury, understanding and recognising terms such as PTSD, but it's actually about trauma. And that is universal. There's a certain quality within the armed forces, a certain quality when associated directly with war, that spreads outside, that spreads to blue light services. There's a different quality. In many ways you can be caught off guard more if you're with the police or the fire service, because it's in a normal environment. When you're with the military, there's a certain context. You're actually on duty, generally. And that spreads out elsewhere. There's many reasons for causes. So it's not just the armed forces, it's not just the blue light services, actually it's societal. And society understands and has recognised that Iraq was wrong. That's why you had the biggest ever demonstration ever. But actually what's happening now is that, just like in Vietnam, the armed forces are holding the shadow of guilt of society, that actually something wrong was done in their name. So you have an added complexity, which is why servicemen, it's partly a political thing, if you glorify the servicemen, which certainly wasn't the case for those who served in Northern Ireland, you were just fucking squaddies. So now we have a glorification of everybody who's serving. Because if you do that, it's very difficult to challenge the war, because there's a serviceman in the way. And bear in mind, what about the families? Just remember, what about the families? What about the wives, the mothers and the children left behind? These are so frequently ignored. It's the person in uniform, male or female, it's the person in uniform who is glorified and called a hero. And what hero accepts being called a hero? Who actually accepts that? Who has acted out of the ordinary? So we now have a very complex situation of perceived support and a lot of money swirling around a lot of organisations. There might be a finger pointing that actually those who need support aren't accepting it because they're typically male and won't accept help. There's a lot of people who think that a sentence on a website equates to support or equates to an agency doing something. But the reality on the ground is that you cannot access support unless you fit within a certain box. And some of the hardest work is done before you can enter that box, like giving up dependency on booze so you can get through the day. So I need some extra coping mechanisms. I go to the NHS for that. They won't accept that person onto their system if they are drinking. But drinking is their coping mechanism. They've gone to them to help to replace drinking as a coping mechanism. And that is someone who might have no concept or understanding of the reality of war, because in society soldiers are glorified and there is a false story being portrayed.